You're listening to the Fan2Fan Podcast, and on this episode, we're talking about the history of zombie movies. That's right. We start with I Walk with a Zombie, White Zombie, all the way up to, of course, the iconic Romero's Night of the Living Dead, to his sequel, Dawn of the Dead. Grab some brains and come along on our history lesson. Here we go. Hey everyone, welcome to the Fan2Fan Podcast. I'm your host, Bernie Gonzalez, and with me is Andrew Murray. Andrew, what's going on? How's it going?
I'm good, Bernie. Thank you for having me on.
Today we're going to be talking about zombies. So if you know them as the infected, the Walking Dead, ghouls, we all know them as zombies, the undead. Andrew and I are going to have a, hopefully, I think, fun conversation about zombies and the themes, the movies that we've enjoyed, their impact on video games, TV. So folks can get to know you a little bit, Andrew, if they have not heard you on our horror movie road trip episodes. Let the folks know a little bit about you, why you love horror movies, and maybe just kind of go right into like, what's your favorite horror movie?
Well, I love horror movies because my family has this ritual of indoctrination into horror movies. All of us my siblings and I have been subjected to horror movies at a young age as street schools of horror films that we've been all brought up with. A few that come to mind, Event Horizon, The Thing. I can't pick just one. And if I had only one I could watch over and over again, I think it would be John Carpenter's The Thing.
That's a good choice. Yeah, we celebrate John Carpenter and everything he does. I think Event Horizon, when I think of that movie, in a way, I mean, maybe this is kind of a bit of a stretch, but it does have a little bit of that like Lovecraftian horror, with that space element obviously thrown in that we saw in like a video game like Doom, where when you talk about zombies, and again, this is a stretch, but like zombies are very malleable. When I think of Lovecraftian horror, you mentioned The Thing, John Carpenter, Prince of Darkness, where you have Alice Cooper essentially like as a zombie in this house, where all these researchers are there, are basically surrounded by these creepy zombies that are just kind of hanging around. Not the only zombies, we're going to talk about a lot of them, but creatures, vampires, werewolves. Like if there's a Mount Rushmore of all these like big horror icons, right? Like you got to put zombies on there.
Yeah, and especially zombies, it seems like it's such a great vehicle to talk about other subtext in the films. Like, I mean, you see just throughout the history of zombie films, there's always been messaging that's been easily able to ride on the coattails of just the gore that is, zombie film.
So let's start with one of the first zombie films ever. Start laying out what the episode's going to feel like. I think it's nice to kind of set up where we are.
I think it will thrill you. It may shock you. It might even horrify you. If any of you feel that you do not care to subject your nerves to such a strain, now is your chance to... we've warned you.
It's 1931. Dracula and Frankenstein have now come out. Bela Lugosi, who's Universal's go-to horror star, comes back to make White Zombie.
From Haiti, land of the voodoo, comes the most infamous cult of all. Bela Lugosi as Murder Legendre. Master of the Undead Damned. The sinister power behind the White Zombie.
White Zombie is considered the first feature-length zombie horror film. He plays a witch doctor with total subtlety. His name is Murder. I wonder what he does. And that movie definitely leaned into the concept of Haitian voodoo zombies. He uses potions and powders to essentially like zombify this young woman. There was a plantation owner, and the idea is that she did not like him, and Bela Lugosi was going to use these powders this zombie ritual so that they would fall in love. So that's White Zombie. And then you have 1943, some years later, I Walk with a Zombie.
And out of their West Indian island comes a tale of terror and voodoo, of witchcraft and zombies, and all the weird black magic that the white man seldom sees. It is a tale of brother against brother, and their love for a woman who lived with the dead. And it is also the tale of a young nurse who never believed such things could happen.
Are you trying to tell me that the voodoo priest could cure Mrs. Holland? Better doctors.
Dambala, this woman is ill.
This is the ceremony of voodoo death, a ceremony that seeks the life of the woman who lives forever, who walks with the dead.
And that revolves again around a nurse who goes to the Caribbean. She's taking care of a patient who's purportedly suffers from zombieism. And then there's a local voodoo cult. So again, leaning into that Haitian Caribbean idea of zombies. 1966, Plague of the Zombies.
This coach is bound for a terrifying destination. Dead. But no corpse can remain at peace in this village of the undead, this land of the zombies. In this place, no one is safe. No one can hide from witchcraft, superstition, and fear. Even Sir James Forbes, the clear-headed man of science, was forced to accept the horrifying facts.
Young Martinez also says that he saw something on the moors, something that he insists was his brother. But we know that his brother is dead. We also know that he is not lying in his coffin. Someone in this village is practicing witchcraft. That corpse wandering on the moors is an undead Azorian.
A place dominated by men without morals, whose bloodlusts are excited by hunting a human quarrel. When Sylvia Forbes hated the young squire, it was dangerous. But when she fell in love with him, it was lethal.
Total hammer horror. Connect the dots back to all the universal black and white characters. Dracula, Frankenstein. Now you have Terrence Fisher making The Gorgon, and then Plague of the Zombies in 1966. Only 2 years before, Romero ends up making Night of the Living Dead in 1968. But if you see Plague of the Zombies, do a Google image search. If you've never seen the movie, well worth watching. But the visual aesthetic of the zombie is in a way, I think you could argue, it's kind of established in Plague of the Zombies. Because before that, you did have the tattered clothes, the idea of the undead coming back to life, wearing whatever they were buried in. But in Plague of the Zombies, you have all that, plus that pale skin, the buggy eyes, the cane look. And because Hammer Horror, they did such a good job like leaning into the Technicolor of the era, where all the Universal monster movies were very classic black and white. Hammer Horror was very much like, they must have bought like the Costco barrel sizes of like red fake blood, because it was everywhere and they were definitely going to use it. And that's where Plague of the Zombies comes out in 1966. Again, 2 years before the granddaddy of them all, kind of set up where you do have pre-Romero and post-Romero. After Night of the Living Dead, that kind of changes everything.
Welcome to a night of total terror. Night of the Living Dead.
Talking about Night of the Living Dead, which understandably should consume a lot of time when you're talking about zombie films. Do you remember the first time you saw Night of the Living Dead?
Yeah, I saw it, I guess, unexpectedly. Like I didn't, it was on and I stumbled into it. Like even to this day, it still holds its own as a horror film. The first time I saw it was probably in the late 90s. It was cable, basic cable.
Night of the Living Dead has such an interesting history because of its public domain status. That could be like its own entire podcast, but because that movie wound up in public domain, it was a movie that I think what were they called? Like creature features that were released in around like the 40s or 50s. You had Universal that realized that they found a lot of success in Dracula and Frankenstein. And then, of course, they just kind of flood the market with movies that are not nearly as good as Dracula or Frankenstein. And you have the beginnings of TV becoming available to people in their homes, but you have to figure out how to fill in the airwaves. You need content. And here you have all these movies that they've created, that they've released in drive-thrus, in theaters in the 40s and the 50s. And little by little, stations just popping up all over the U.S. What's the best way to fill in a bunch of content on like a Saturday night? Well, you throw in like some B movie, atomic age monster movie. People like our parents, they're staying up late at night as kids watching Dracula, Frankenstein, The Creeping Hand, all of these movies that are not necessarily like, some are classics, some are just like so bad they're good movies, but they're movies that are starting to set up the table for people like Romero, who then in 1968 makes Night of the Living Dead. There's this entire cool history of all of these creature features that are out there. And that's where you get like the horror host trend, like Svengoolie and all those guys that just kind of start taking these movies that are essentially free because some of them are in public domain or they're cheap. And then they're able to make fun of them or just play them on late at night. That's also, I think, why Night of the Living Dead becomes so popular.
I don't feel bad, no, because I love the genre, I've always loved it from when I was a boy. I loved it. And so I don't feel bad. I feel great about being able to be part of it,
It's kind of similar to, I think, the history of It's a Wonderful Life, where it came out, it was a bomb into theaters, and then it starts becoming popular because stations are just trying to figure out what to play around Christmas. So they play this movie, and all of a sudden now it's a seminal classic, but not necessarily because people loved it in the beginning. It's because people were just forced to watch it because it was something to watch on TV, and then everyone gets used to it. I think there's some of that legacy with Night of the Living Dead that just makes it that much more popular and has set up the table, like you said, for the Renaissance and everyone else that now looks back to it, because they don't necessarily go back and look to White Zombie or I Walk with a Zombie. It's like, no, you go back to Night of the Living Dead.
Yeah. With, what Romero did, there's a shift in zombies, because like White Zombies and then the zombie movies, throughout the 50s to the 60s, they were more towards the traditional kind of voodoo zombie aesthetic, where it's more about control or maybe, some sort of pseudo or authoritarianism, control over the mind of someone and having them inside this, state. And, with Romero, you get the shambling zombie archetype now that's, more derived from external forces that may not be a goal of one individual like puppet master, but, just kind of this environmental effect that starts to wash over everyone. The Romero zombies that come after that, is this great mechanism of storytelling for the uncontrollable, thoughtless masses. I mean, horror genres have always been not mainstream genres. And so, like, especially for Romero's film, to have this indie film with a genre that's not necessarily as mainstream as the other genres, definitely increasing the exposure to people helps it find that audience that can really propel it and have it continue to go forward. Just like you mentioning It's a Wonderful Life. Like, I mean, it bombed, it got picked up and, was syndicated for Christmas, and it is a captive audience when you're with your family and you have 3 channels on the station.
I think that's a good place to start. So if we're kind of breaking this up, I think we go into the idea of themes in zombie films, because we have genres in zombie films and they'll probably bleed into each other. And I think this goes for all zombie films. Zombie films reflect the worries of the era and probably of the filmmakers who are making them at the time they make it. Those early zombie films, it's the atomic era. After World War II, and even like right before World War II, you have the idea of like space travel and satellites, radar and microwaves. There's this quantum leap in technology and accessibility to technology in TVs and cars. All of this is just permeating into the home. And with that, the idea that we don't understand how waves work, how radar works, how atoms work. So you have all those creature features that do that. But at the same time, you also have civil unrest, racial tensions, all of that that's reflected in these movies. And especially with Night of the Living Dead, you do have that anti-communist hysteria, like that idea of the other. If George Romero, and I've seen some pictures of him, and he looks like he could be in his 30s when he's making Night of the Living Dead. And that means he grew up, as a teenager with World War II happening, right? With all that idea of, in Europe, the other, the savage, the brute, the idea that might makes right. We're trying to save the ideals of America and liberty and independent thinking. And then you have the idea of the horde, or that hive mind in the zombie, this automaton that's just kind of like walking around almost like a Neanderthal, this very focused thing of trying to eat the flesh. And I think that's a part of that idea of like, we value our individualism, our creativity as Americans. And then the idea that you have in Russia, in the Soviet Union, this communism that we don't understand. So since we don't understand it, let's just make it into something really scary. Before that, you have movies like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, where the idea that it's so scary that if the communists come here and they end up taking us, the Red Scare, they'll actually replace your neighbor and like your coworker and turn them into like these completely brainless, almost alien type creatures. The other that we got to fight. We've got to do what we can to prevent that from happening. That's the backdrop to Night of the Living Dead, this apocalyptic event happening with all of that in the background that certainly has to inspire Romero, Russo, and all the people that end up making Night of the Living Dead.
Filmmakers being able to leverage societal context in order to accentuate, bring people up to speed into the universe that they're kind of creating within this film. So they feel like, there's logical things that they can pull in. And I wonder if, one of the things that helps Night of the Living Dead be so everlasting is because, there are certain contexts, there's certain messages that are still true today that it really kind of still is able to pick up on and use either the issues that it's talking about still being issues today, or just the issues has woven themselves into the history of just our culture that, it can easily be picked up and referenced upon and built upon.
And especially in Night of the Living Dead, with all the different personalities, different ages, social classes in that farmhouse. The younger couple that could argue, they almost seem to be like beatniks versus like the nuclear family that has the little girl and they seem to be a little bit more uptight,
And they're secretly building a bunker in their backyard.
Absolutely. Of course. Absolutely. Yeah. Like they're the people who make enough money to build the bunker. And at the same time, you have Barbara, who's just completely suffering from this PTSD after seeing her brother turn into a zombie after being assaulted by this creature at a cemetery at a time when they just lost, I think it's their mother or father, which is why they're at the cemetery to begin with. You put all of that together and the creatures aren't like a werewolf or Frankenstein, where it's got the bolts in its neck and it looks like something that you should understandably run away from, versus in Night of the Living Dead, where the zombies, the ghouls, look like us, like they look like them. Sure, they walk a little slower and they look like they're a little worse for wear, but because they look like us, they may not feel necessarily as a threat until they get that close. And I don't know, there seems to be something really intimate and psychological about it.
There's this like very subtle, unnerving feeling you have watching them because, the behavior is unusual, but not to the point where it's a big blinking sign to run away.
They're not drooling with shark fangs or something. Well, I'm not going to get close to that. That's obviously a werewolf. I'm going to walk away. Like that's not good. But just the fact that they look like your neighbor, they walk a little slower, all of that communist hysteria has to be involved in there. And you got to imagine that people who saw it, maybe not conscious, but subconsciously are seeing this after movies like Invasion of the Body Snatchers and then Night of the Living Dead and thinking, this is the world that we live in. But I think that's no different than Romero then following that up with Dawn of the Dead.
In 1968, George Romero brought us Night of the Living Dead. It became the classic horror film of its time. Now, George Romero brings us the most intensely shocking motion picture experience for all times. Dawn of the Dead. Night of the Living Dead has ended. Dawn of the Dead is here.
It gets up and kills. The people it kills get up and kill.
They must be destroyed on sight.
When there is no more room in hell, the dead will walk the earth. Dawn of the Dead. This picture contains scenes of violence that may be considered shocking. No one under 17 will be admitted.
Right before the 80s, because that's 78. And it's in this anti-consumerism, but at the same time, like greed is good, capitalism and credit cards and the Reagan era and people just buying stuff. So then he just takes his zombies that he created in 68, 10 years later, and puts these survivors not in a farmhouse, but in a mall. And not only a mall, but in essentially kind of like this weird idyllic world where, yes, but for the zombie apocalypse happening outside the doors, if you're a kid growing up, of course I want to be like stuck in a mall with like KB toys and Toys R Us and being able to do whatever you want. Whether, again, he's doing this on purpose or not, he's definitely reflecting the worries, the tensions of that era.
Yeah. And it was really not any subtlety, too. It's getting into an era where cash seems to be a little bit more free and more attainable, and, you know, consumerism kicks into high gear. All of those elements are still there inside the movie at the forefront. And then also, you know, the behavior of the zombies, seeing them actually in the mall and walking around harkens to when you are in a mall and you see people shambling around from store to store.
How different is it from around the holidays? You know, you can occasionally see those Black Friday videos where people almost assaulting the storefronts and poor retail workers that are like holding back the doors. How is that any different than juxtaposing the shots of the zombies at the doors of the mall, banging on the door because they can sense the flesh? How is that any different from the people outside that can sense the Black Friday discounts? It's not that far removed.
As it's a rampant hunger just directed to a different type of victim.
Absolutely.
A theme that I've always used is just this idea that we don't talk to each other. I mean, this complete lack of communication that we have, and a willingness to adopt a position.
People aren't willing to accept your solutions, Doctor, and I, for one, don't blame them.
Every dead body that is not exterminated becomes one of them. It gets up and kills. The people it kills get up and kill.
You know, this sort of tribalism, or, you know, I think it's white, I think it's black. And there's no attempt to try to figure out, you know, any sort of middle ground or build a bridge. I mean, that's true in everything from religious wars to the O.J. Simpson case.
I'm not so sure what to believe, Doctor. All we get is what you people tell us. And it's hard enough to believe. It's hard enough to believe without you coming in here. And
you're not running a talk show here, Mr. Berman. You can forget pitching an audience the moral bullshit.
To me, that is the most appalling thing about what we do to each other. And so it's a theme that I've worked with, particularly in the zombie films.